A black billionaire woman is targeted and arrested by an abusive cop just for her presence. He has no idea that his actions are about to trigger a chain of events that will reveal hidden truths. What will happen when the world discovers who she really is and the injustices she has endured? Subscribe to the channel and follow along to see how this powerful story unfolds. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. That afternoon, soft sunlight shone down on the bustling streets of the city, but Vivian Sinclair, the black billionaire woman, had chosen a quiet corner to reflect. Dressed in simple clothing, she looked like any ordinary woman, and that was just how she wanted it. Vivian had endured a challenging journey to reach the top, from hard days in a rough neighborhood to becoming one of the world's most powerful business leaders. Moments like this, sitting quietly, brought her a rare sense of peace amid life's relentless pace. But the peace didn't last long. Heavy footsteps echoed from the end of the empty street, their sound bouncing off the brick pavement. Vivian looked up, sensing a chill in the air. A police officer was approaching. His gaze was cold, his face showing undisguised contempt. This was Officer Walker, a name well known in the community for rumors about his harsh and uncontrolled behavior. "You think you can just sit here?" Walker's voice came out, both rude and mocking. Vivian looked at him, feeling the tension rise. She didn't say anything, just kept a calm gaze, though she felt a keen alertness in her gut. "This isn't a place to hang out," Walker continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He looked Vivian up and down, his eyes filled with prejudice. "This is a decent neighborhood, not a place for people like you." Walker's words made Vivian clench her hands under her coat. She felt anger rise in her chest, but she kept calm. Growing up through hardship had taught her to face disdain without letting it shake her. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice steady but clear. "I'm just sitting here for a moment." Walker sneered, a cold sound with no hint of friendliness. "You don't understand how things work here, do you? I decide what's right or wrong, and you sitting here, looking like that, is wrong." The tension in Vivian's heart became palpable, but she held her ground. She knew she had to be cautious, not letting this escalate, but she also couldn't let herself be pushed back by a stereotype. Yet she also understood that confronting an abusive officer like Walker was never easy. Vivian kept her back straight, her eyes meeting Walker's threatening stare. "You have no right to tell me I can't sit here." Walker's eyes flared with anger, his mouth tightening. "You think you're smart, huh?" He stepped closer, his gaze full of challenge. "Maybe I should teach you a lesson about respecting the law." Vivian felt her heart beating fast in her chest, but her gaze didn't waver from Walker. She had faced many big challenges in her life, but she'd never been threatened by an abuser right in the street like this. Walker took another step, close enough that she could see the scorn in his eyes. She knew her next move had to be careful. "Stand up," Walker ordered, his voice commanding, his right hand lightly touching his gun belt as an unspoken warning. His gaze swept over the empty street, as if looking for a witness to justify his oppression. But there was no one there, and the silence of the street made the situation even more suffocating. "I'm not breaking any law," Vivian responded, her voice calm but firm. She didn't stand up, not out of defiance but because she knew she had the same rights as anyone else. Anger simmered within her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Any sign of fear or loss of control might only embolden Walker. Walker smirked, leaning down closer. "Who do you think you are? You think you're special when anyone could be dragged to the station if need be?" Vivian didn't answer. She just looked straight at Walker, her gaze full of confidence and resolve. Her silence only made Walker angrier. He stood upright, his face reddening. In an instant, he raised his hand and shoved her shoulder. Vivian stumbled but quickly regained her balance. The sense of disrespect flared, and her eyes glinted with anger. She didn't back down, though fear crept in. Walker's gaze was cold, and Vivian knew the situation could become more dangerous. But she had no intention of letting someone like him intimidate her. She emphasized each word, her voice low and clear. "You have no right to do that." Walker grabbed her arm forcefully, yanking her up roughly. "Do you think there's anyone here to protect you?" His voice was low and threatening. "Let me show you. Here, I am the law." Vivian suppressed a pang of pain as Walker's grip tightened on her arm. For a moment, she felt her heart pounding, but her gaze stayed firm. She couldn't back down. She wouldn't back down. At that moment, a voice cut through the air from behind, sharp and full of authority. "Take your hands off her now." Walker turned around, his eyes filled with anger and surprise as he saw Daniel Reed. The cop's gaze flickered for a moment, but quickly returned to a cold and challenging look. Walker clenched his jaw, clearly displeased with the interruption. "Who are you? This isn't your business. Move along." Daniel took another step forward, unfazed by the implied threat in Walker's voice. "I'm someone who witnessed this whole situation, and I won't stand by while she's treated unfairly," Daniel said, his voice sharp yet calm. His eyes met Vivian's, conveying empathy and determination, as if promising he wouldn't let her face this alone. Walker sneered, a forced smile of challenge flashing across his face. "It's just a misunderstanding, sir. But I'd advise you not to interfere with police matters if you don't want trouble." He still held Vivian's arm, but his posture showed tension. Daniel didn't look away from Walker. "I'm willing to face trouble if it means defending her rights," he said firmly. "And if you think this abuse of power will go unchallenged, then you're mistaken." Vivian felt the pressure of Walker's hand loosen slightly, but the tension hadn't lifted. Her gaze shifted from Walker to Daniel, a feeling of gratitude mixed with relief filling her heart. For the first time in this entire encounter, she no longer felt alone. "I'll remember this," Walker said through gritted teeth, his eyes flashing with restrained anger. He let go of Vivian and backed off, still shooting her a warning look. "But don't think this is over. You should be careful. Not everyone will be here to protect you." Daniel stood protectively in front of Vivian, a stance of unmistakable defense. "We'll see who needs to be careful, Officer Walker." In the silent moments that followed, Walker retreated, taking heavy steps back to his patrol car, giving a final cold look before leaving. Vivian exhaled slowly, feeling the tension release. She turned to Daniel, her eyes grateful but still calm. "Thank you, Daniel," she said softly but sincerely. Daniel nodded, his gaze softening but still resolute. "I couldn't just watch that happen, Vivian. We need to make sure he's held accountable." Vivian stood silently for a moment, still feeling the tremors from the tension that had just passed. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder as a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight, but the relief was short-lived as another patrol car pulled up in front of them. The red and blue lights flashed, illuminating the stern faces of two officers stepping out. They approached with firm strides, their eyes showing no mercy. "We need you to come with us," one of the officers said, his voice steady but devoid of sympathy. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but Vivian gently shook her head, her gaze unwaveringly determined. She knew she had to face this directly, and she needed to keep herself calm to prepare for what lay ahead. "Don't worry, Daniel," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll be fine." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of worry and determination. "I'll contact a lawyer right away. Don't let them do anything without a lawyer present, Vivian." She gave him a small smile, a reassuring but powerful one. "I know." Vivian got into the patrol car, feeling the cold metal seat through her clothes, a reminder of the harsh reality she was about to face. The streetlights flashing through the car windows reflected in her eyes, but there was no fear, only determination. She sat straight, looking out the window as the car rolled toward the police station. The familiar cityscape outside, its buildings and roads, suddenly felt foreign. When they arrived, the slam of the car door echoed in the heavy silence. Vivian was led into the station, the space inside cold and drab. The bright, fluorescent lights from the ceiling shone down, creating a harsh, stark feel. The sharp scent of disinfectant filled the air, making her wrinkle her nose. She could hear laughter, keyboard clicks, and officers' footsteps outside, but inside the interrogation room where she sat, everything was eerily silent. Vivian sat down on the hard metal chair, feeling the cold seep through her skin. She placed her hands lightly on the table, trembling slightly from the adrenaline still in her veins. She took a deep breath, trying to keep herself from slipping into anger or fear. She remembered the tough days of her youth when she overcame one obstacle after another to prove herself, not only to society but to herself. Those memories now served as a source of strength, helping her face the current situation with resolve. The door to the room opened suddenly, and Walker entered with a cold smile on his face. He stood for a moment before slowly stepping toward Vivian, his gaze full of challenge. "Do you think that having someone stand up for you changes anything?" His voice was low, cutting through the air like a knife gliding over glass. "You think you've won?" Vivian looked up, her eyes meeting Walker's hateful gaze. Even though her heart was still racing, she kept her voice steady. "I don't think I've won," she replied, each word carefully enunciated. "But I know this is just the beginning." Walker frowned, his twisted smile fading. The space between them felt tense as they stared each other down, neither backing down. Finally, Walker stepped back, his eyes flashing with repressed anger. "You'll soon see who really has power here," he said, then turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. Vivian sat in silence, listening to Walker's footsteps fade away. The silence returned, but this time she no longer felt helpless. Instead, she felt a strong determination. She knew that this fight would be long, but she was ready to face it all. For justice, for herself, and for those without a voice. The ticking of the clock on the wall echoed in the silence, each second passing slowly. In her mind, Walker's threats still echoed like an annoying sound that couldn't be shaken. However, instead of feeling fear, Vivian felt a burning fire inside, reminding her that this wasn't her first time facing adversity. The door to the room suddenly opened, and Vivian turned her head. Her eyes met Sandra Mills, a woman with a strong presence and sharp, confident eyes. Daniel followed behind Sandra, his face tense but his gaze resolute. The light from the hallway outside spilled in, bringing a touch of warmth and hope. "Vivian," Sandra called her name, her voice steady yet powerful. She pulled a chair across from Vivian, setting her black briefcase on the table and opening it. Daniel sat beside Vivian, his eyes filled with concern and conviction. "I spoke with Sandra on the way here," Daniel said, his voice low but protective. "She's one of the best lawyers I know. We're not letting this go easily." Sandra looked at Vivian, her sharp eyes meeting Vivian's with an unmistakable determination. "We'll bring Walker and anyone involved to light. But first I need to hear from you from start to finish, without leaving out any details." Vivian took a deep breath, suppressing the mixed emotions within her. She began recounting everything, from sitting on the shop steps, hearing the heavy footsteps, to how Walker approached her with arrogance and intimidation. Every word she spoke was filled with anger and the pain of being oppressed. Sandra listened intently, taking notes continuously, not missing a single detail. As Vivian described how Walker shoved her and brought her to the station under duress, Sandra's eyes grew sharper. Daniel, sitting quietly beside her, clenched his fists as he listened to every detail. He felt the injustice Vivian had endured, and it only strengthened his resolve to protect her. "Walker has a history of abuse of power," Sandra said, her voice growing tense after hearing Vivian's story. "I've heard about his behavior crossing the line, but no one ever seriously challenged him. But now, it's different." "What's our next move?" Vivian asked, her voice less tense but still tinged with fatigue. She felt her strength starting to return, little by little. Sandra closed her notebook, her gaze firm. "First, we'll file a lawsuit against Walker and the police chief, demanding a full investigation into his actions. I also want it stated in the case file that this isn't just individual misconduct, but a systemic issue that needs to be addressed." Daniel added, his eyes filled with resolve as he looked at Vivian. "They won't accept this easily, Vivian. They'll fight back, try to smear you and weaken the case." Vivian remained silent for a moment, then looked up, her gaze filled with strong resolve. "I've faced scorn and oppression my whole life, Daniel. They can try to bring me down, but I won't. Back down. This isn't just for me. It's for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly without a chance to speak out." Sandra gave a small, rare smile, full of encouragement. "Then let's start right now. I'll contact the press and make this case public. They'll know Walker messed with the wrong person this time." The room was silent again for a long moment, but it was no longer lonely and tense. Instead, it was filled with a sense of readiness for a battle not just to protect Vivian, but to send a powerful message. Justice will be sought. News of Vivian Sinclair's lawsuit spread like wildfire, not only in the city but nationwide. Major newspapers, from reputable print papers to social media sites, reported on the black billionaire standing up against a notorious abusive cop. Headlines like "Billionaire challenges the system" and "Vivian Sinclair leading the fight against abuse of power" flooded everywhere. In her office, Vivian looked out the window, seeing the sunlight shining on the lively city below. But a heavy feeling weighed in her heart, knowing the real battle was just beginning. The phone rang, breaking the quiet space, pulling Vivian from her thoughts. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. She answered, his voice a mix of concern and anxiety. "Vivian, have you read the comments? We're getting a lot of support, but also plenty of criticism." "I've seen them, Daniel," Vivian replied, her voice calm but betraying a hint of fatigue. Her eyes scanned her computer screen, where comments appeared non-stop. Some praised her for her courage, calling her a pioneer in the fight against injustice. But there were also negative comments, doubting her motives accusing her of exploiting the incident to build her image or protect personal interests. "These criticisms are just the beginning," Daniel said, his voice lowering. "They'll dig into your past, find every way to slander and discredit you. But you're not alone. Sandra is ready to respond to anything." Vivian was silent for a moment, her eyes following the stream of cars rushing below. She recalled the time when, as a little girl, she had to fight to be recognized in her poor neighborhood when those around her dismissed her dreams. Those memories were not only painful, but also a source of strength. "I know, Daniel. I prepared myself for this," she said, her eyes firm. "We won't back down." Just then, a knock on the door sounded, and Sandra entered with a thick file in her hand. Her face showed focus and determination. "Vivian, we need to talk," she began, her voice full of resolve. "Today's press conference is crucial. This is the chance to tell the story from your perspective and assert why we're fighting." Vivian nodded, her eyes showing both tension and a glimmer of resolve. "I understand, Sandra. I know we have to deliver a strong, clear message." "Exactly," Sandra said, placing the file on the desk and opening it. "But you need to be mentally prepared for all kinds of questions, even difficult ones. They'll try to throw you off and question your motives." Daniel sat down beside Vivian, his eyes filled with support. "You're not doing this alone, Vivian. The whole team is here with you." Vivian exhaled a long breath, feeling the weight on her shoulders but also the strong support from those around her. That afternoon's press conference was the first step for her to speak out publicly and clarify the truth. In the afternoon, the press room was packed. Camera flashes blinked non-stop, the murmur of hundreds of voices creating a tense, suspenseful background. Vivian stepped onto the podium, feeling her heart race, but her gaze remained steady. Sandra stood in the corner of the room, hands holding the stack of documents, her eyes fixed on Vivian, ready to step in if needed. "Thank you all for being here today," Vivian began, her voice ringing out strongly over the microphone. The whispers died down as everyone listened intently. "I stand here today not just for myself, but for all who have been treated unjustly without a chance to speak up. Abuse of power can't continue, and we must make a change." Questions poured in, ranging from supportive to subtly accusatory. An older journalist stood up, his voice full of doubt. "Ms. Sinclair, do you believe what you're doing is truly for justice, or is it just a way to bolster your image?" Vivian looked him in the eye, unflinching. "I don't need to bolster my image, sir," she said, her voice low and firm. "I achieved what I have through relentless hard work. What I'm doing today isn't for fame or money, but to uphold human dignity and stop abuse, not only for myself, but for anyone who's been dismissed." The atmosphere in the room seemed to shift. Every eye was on Vivian, who stood not just as a billionaire but as a symbol of resilience and courage. Daniel smiled gently, nodding with pride. Sandra looked at Vivian with warmth, knowing they had done the right thing. Vivian stepped out of the press room, feeling the exhaustion settle in her muscles, but her heart full of resolve. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the city. She realized that her words were not only to defend herself, but to inspire. Hope for those without a voice. Daniel and Sandra walked beside her, all three knowing that. The real challenges lay ahead. As they reached the building's grand lobby, a man in a police uniform was waiting. The ceiling lights reflected off the shiny badge on his chest, catching Vivian's attention. Daniel quickly glanced at the stranger, his eyes wary, while Sandra squinted, her hands gripping the document stack. The officer approached slowly, his face showing a mix of tension and determination. "Excuse me, Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice low but sure. "I'm Officer Grant. I'm here because I have something important to tell you." Vivian looked at him in surprise, a brief silence falling over them. Daniel inhaled deeply, his eyes scrutinizing Grant, trying to gauge his motives. Sandra took a step forward, maintaining a cautious attitude. "We're listening, Officer Grant," she said, her tone calm yet firm. Grant swallowed as if gathering the courage for what he was about to say. "I've worked with Walker for years. I know exactly who he is and what he's done." He hesitated, then continued, his voice heavy. "I've seen him abuse his power, targeting people who can't defend themselves, and I stayed silent out of fear and pressure from above." A wave of emotion rose in Vivian. She knew that for a police officer to stand up against a colleague was incredibly rare and risky. "So, what changed?" she asked, her voice not hiding her emotion. Grant sighed, his eyes filled with regret. "When I saw you stand up and face that abuse, I realized that my silence was no longer acceptable. I couldn't keep turning a blind eye. What Walker did isn't just wrong. It destroys people's trust in people like us, those who are supposed to uphold justice." Daniel leaned toward Grant, his eyes filled with a spark of hope. "You understand, this could put your career at risk, don't you?" Grant nodded, a weary smile appearing. "I know, but if I don't do this now, I'll never be able to look at myself in the mirror without feeling ashamed. Justice is worth the price." Sandra smiled slightly, her sharp eyes showing respect. "If you're willing to testify and provide an official statement, that will make a big difference. We need all the support we can get to bring this case to light." Grant took a deep breath and looked straight into Vivian's eyes, his gaze full of resolve. "I'm ready. I'll provide any information you need and testify. I want everyone to know the truth about Walker and what he's done." The air in the lobby seemed to settle, a heavy silence blanketing them, but no longer filled with tension. It was the silence of trust and solidarity. Vivian felt a wave of emotion. She wasn't just facing Walker and the system, but also gaining strength from those willing to stand up for what was right. "Thank you, Grant," she said, her voice low but sincere. "You don't know how much this means to me and others." Grant smiled faintly, his eyes glowing with rare warmth. "You don't need to thank me. This is something I have to do." After Grant left to prepare the next steps, Vivian turned to Daniel and Sandra. Their eyes were filled with a sense of mutual agreement, a reminder that this battle now had support from within, marking a major turning point in the journey for justice. "We just gained a major ally," Sandra said firmly. "Now, we need to move quickly to turn this into legal strength." Daniel placed his hand on Vivian's shoulder, smiling with pride. "We're making a difference, and you're at the heart of that change." Vivian looked out the window, where the street lights began to glow under the twilight sky. She felt a new strength rising within her, a conviction that justice was no longer a distant goal. With people like Grant willing to stand up and her steadfast allies beside her, she knew this fight had entered the stage where the truth would be revealed. Outside, a crowd had gathered early, filled with journalists, supporters, and even onlookers there out of curiosity. The hum of hundreds of voices blended together, creating a tense, suspenseful backdrop. The flashlights from cameras flickered continuously, illuminating each step Vivian took as she entered the building, her gaze firm, unshaken. Inside, the courtroom was packed. The seats were filled, from reporters ready to broadcast live to regular citizens who had heard about the case through media channels. The room was loud and tense, with all eyes on the plaintiff's table where Vivian and Sandra sat. Daniel sat right behind them, his expression tense but full of support. Walker entered the room, his face cold and his eyes sharp as knives, but Vivian could see the tension flickering in his gaze. He sat at the defendant's table with his team of lawyers, trying to maintain confidence but clearly worried about today's events. Sandra stood up, stepping forward, her eyes scanning the room before focusing on the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case isn't just an isolated incident but a reflection of a larger issue within the system, she said, her voice strong and piercing. Vivian Sinclair is not the only victim, but a representative of many others who have faced abuse of power without a voice. The jury listened closely. They were faces of all ages and professions, carrying the heavy responsibility of deciding the fate of this case. The atmosphere in the room grew serious, the tension hanging like a heavy cloak. When Grant was called to the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He stepped up with confidence, though his face showed clear tension. He glanced at Walker before focusing on the jury. "I've worked with Officer Walker for many years," he began, his voice clear. "I've witnessed his actions, his abuses of power that I remained silent about for far too long." A quiet murmur rippled through the room as Grant recounted specific instances of Walker targeting the vulnerable and committing unnecessary force. Each story increased the tension in the air, and the jury's eyes grew sharper. Walker sat there, his face tense, his gaze locked on Grant. Vivian saw the unease in the way his hand gripped the table, and she knew that the truth was chipping away at Walker's feigned confidence. "Thank you, Officer Grant," Sandra said as she concluded her questioning. She turned back to look at Vivian, her gaze resolute. This was the moment they had prepared for, and she knew they had just secured an essential foothold in the case. Walker's lawyer rose, approaching Grant with a forced smile and a calculating look in his eyes. "Officer Grant, you've worked with Walker for many years. Do you have a personal motive to testify against your colleague?" he asked, his tone deliberately casting doubt. Grant didn't flinch. He responded with admirable calm. "My motive is justice, the truth I've kept silent about for too long. If I don't speak up now, I become part of the problem." Behind him, Vivian felt her heart pounding. She knew that every word Grant spoke resonated within the jury and those in the courtroom. She saw a glimmer of hope in Daniel's eyes, and Sandra, too, smiled faintly, a smile of encouragement and trust. The trial lasted all day with questions and intense arguments. Walker's lawyers tried to defend him, bringing in arguments to justify his actions. But each time they steered the story in a different direction, Sandra skillfully brought it back to the core truth. Walker had abused his power and hurt Vivian, an innocent person. At the end of the first day of the trial, Vivian stepped out of the courtroom in the late afternoon. The sounds outside still buzzed, but she felt a new strength rising within her. She had stood firm against the challenges and knew that tomorrow would bring more to face. But, with the support of those beside her, she believed that justice was not a distant dream. The second day of the trial began with a heavy, expectant atmosphere. Vivian stood before the courthouse, exuding confidence, though she couldn't entirely shake the feeling of nervousness seeping into her heart. The hum outside the courtroom reverberated like tense background music, from the crowd's discussions to the reporters scrambling for the latest updates. As Vivian entered the courtroom, her eyes met Sandra's, who was arranging the final set of documents. Beside her was Daniel, his face showing a mix of determination and worry. They gave her a nod of encouragement. Today was the day that all their preparation, sacrifice, and courage would be tested. Walker sat at the defendant's table, his eyes trying to feign calmness, but his clenched hands revealed his tension. His legal team murmured to each other, their eyes full of calculation, trying to find a way to turn the situation around. Sandra stepped before the jury, her powerful voice ringing through the quiet room. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is a reminder that power, when placed in the wrong hands, can become a weapon of destruction. But we're also here to prove that justice can prevail when the truth is brought to light. She turned back, looking at the jury, her eyes full of resolve. Today, we're not just judging a man, but we're affirming that our society will not tolerate abuse of power. Sandra's words seemed to awaken everyone in the room. Eyes turned to one another, unspoken agreement spreading through the jurors. On the other side, Walker's attorney tried to remain calm, but had clearly lost their initial confidence. They presented their final rebuttal, offering points of defense, but lacking the necessary strength. Then it was time for the jury to leave the courtroom to deliberate, a period when every second seemed to stretch into eternity. Vivian sat quietly, her gaze following the wall clock, each tick seemingly daring her patience. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support. After hours of tense waiting, the courtroom doors opened again and the jury returned. Every eye turned to the foreperson, who stood with a paper in hand. The room's atmosphere froze as everyone held their breath. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Bryce Walker, guilty on all counts. A wave of reactions rippled through the courtroom, from applause, sighs of relief to emotional murmurs. Walker sat motionless, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. His legal team whispered among themselves, bracing for failure but unable to accept the truth. Vivian felt an immense weight lift, as if a boulder had been removed from her chest. She looked at Sandra, who wore a soft but satisfied smile. Daniel stood up, his eyes shimmering with pride and emotion as he gazed at her. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had been waiting. As Vivian stepped out, a cheer rose, applause resounding like waves. Supporters surrounded her, their gazes filled with admiration and emotion, seeing her as a symbol of resilience and justice. Flashbulbs blinked constantly, capturing a moment the entire city would remember. A young reporter, her voice shaking with emotion, stepped forward with a microphone. "Ms. Sinclair, is there anything you'd like to share with everyone?" Vivian paused, taking a deep breath. She looked at the crowd, her eyes shining with determination and gratitude. Today, we proved that justice isn't a privilege, but a right for everyone. This isn't just my victory, but a victory for everyone who's been overlooked, dismissed, and unheard. I hope that from now on, no one has to fear speaking up. The applause echoed, and Vivian felt the joy and relief flooding her heart. She turned to Daniel and Sandra, seeing them both smiling. It was not only the satisfaction of a win, but an affirmation that the efforts and courage had not been in vain. After the congratulations and support, Daniel pulled Vivian aside to a quieter corner. "You did it, Vivian," he said, his voice low but full of warmth. "You've changed more than you realize." Vivian smiled, her eyes reflecting hope. "We did it," she replied, her voice filled with gratitude and sincerity. But this is just the beginning. We have a lot more to do to make sure justice is upheld. Sandra approached, her eyes brimming with pride. We'll keep fighting. That's one thing I know for sure. Vivian turned back to the crowd, still standing under the courthouse steps, waving and calling her name. They were proof of change, of the power of courage and unyielding determination. She descended the steps, feeling the bright sunlight on her face, as if reminding her that justice, though difficult, could be achieved if one didn't give up. And, with steady steps, Vivian knew that a new journey had begun, one that she and her supporters would continue to write, full of resolve and justice. The conclusion of Vivian's story is a powerful testament to courage, perseverance, and the capacity for change when one confronts injustice. It reminds us that no matter how difficult, standing up for what's right is always worth it. Justice isn't easy, but with people like Vivian, Sandra, Daniel, and Grant willing to step up, it becomes tangible and achievable. The final message this story wants to convey is, none of us should remain silent in the face of injustice. Stand up, not only for yourself, but for everyone who can't raise their voice. Only when we come together, supporting each other, can society become fairer and better. If this story touched your heart, follow and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories. We're committed to bringing you tales of courage, hope, and justice to inspire you every day. Click subscribe and help spread the good.